Um, must start by apologising for not being with you in the flesh, particularly ironical in a session on embodiment. Um, I want to talk to start out with some general reflections about theory and theorising, um, and then show how that connects to at least some issues about bodies and embodiment. The first point I want to make is a very simple but I think most important point, that theory is a form of work. It's a particular kind of intellectual labour, to specify the broad category of work. Um, but the fact that it is made actually almost literally built or sewed or knitted, depending on your choice of metaphor, is really quite important. Among other things, that points out that theory requires a workforce. There has to be people who are doing the knitting or the building. And they have to exist as real people in the world. It implies that the work of theorising has an institutional context, and that implies a larger social context. There are flows of resources that are used in the work of theory. And it also means that theory tends to happen in particular sites, literally in particular places much of the time, which we somewhat awkwardly acknowledge sometimes by naming a theoretical perspective after a place. For instance, when we talk about the Chicago School in sociology, or the Vienna Circle in philosophy, or something like that, or even our splendid term, the Academy, actually refers to a place in ancient Athens. Now, of course, nowadays that site might be online if your work is, as a theorist, is connected to other workers through online chat group or special online conferencing or something like that. But nevertheless, there's a certain specificity to the business of doing, of actually doing this work, doing theory. Now, that's the first point I want to make, and I've just suggest that some of the significance that insight leads to. The second basic point I want to make is that theory as work, theoretical labour, at least in the world of disciplinary knowledge that is the base of the university curriculum internationally, though it's not, as we know, the only form of knowledge that can be deployed. But in the world of disciplinary knowledge, theorising, it seems to me at any rate, is certain parts of a larger labour process which has the effect of producing organised knowledge, or more exactly, advancing a field of organised knowledge, since we're, as constructors of knowledge, we are always working at the edge of some kind of archive of pre-existing knowledge. And the other forms of labour that are involved in the making of disciplinary knowledge are such things as learning and understanding that archive of pre-existing knowledge around a given set of problems, what graduate students are obliged to do when they write the chapter that introduces the literature in the field and shows what the state of the literature is and why the work for the PhD or the master's is necessary as taking the next step. So there's certain looking backwards. There's also labour involved in encounters with materials, experiments, field observation, interviews, whatever. And at the logical end of the process of knowledge creation is the process of circulating knowledge, broadcasting, as I call it in chapter 1 of my book, The Good University, where you'll find this stuff spelled out in a bit more detail. The theoretical part of this larger process, I broadly divide into two activities, two, if you like, sub-forms of labour. One is what I call patterning, which is, for instance, finding or applying or creating concepts. For instance, in discussions about bodies and embodiment, this work might involve identifying types or groups of bodies, or perhaps more powerfully often, types of situations that arise in processes of embodiment or moving beyond existing forms of embodiment. But if you then push patterning a bit further forward, this might include kinds of model building you find, for instance, in many areas of biological science, forms of interpretation, which you find extensively in the humanities, such as historical work, and so forth. Okay, so there's the labour of patterning, I think, is embedded in many, in one way or another, actually, in all forms of disciplinary knowledge. The other broad category of theoretical work is what I would call critique. In a rather specialised notion of, in the context of disciplinary knowledge, as we generate new information, develop new concepts out of it, or configurations or understandings of situations, we always have to revise the archive. And that is, if you like, the moment of growth in disciplinary knowledge always involves a critique of the archive or of the conclusions that had been accepted in a given area, or of the limits on previous knowledge which is now being extended or revised or subverted by what we now can bring to the table. And this can apply to any of the many archives of existing knowledge that affect bodies and embodiment. So we might go to the kind of archive that's represented, say, by the Lancet, the biomedical sciences, and so forth, and use some of the search tools that we're now familiar with. But we also might go to the archive of much less formalised knowledge, which we speak of as queer theory, for instance. Or we might go to the archive of sociological reflection on bodies, or finally, well, not finally, but also we might go to what I've called Southern theory, that is the forms of knowledge that emerge from colonial and post-colonial societies, and which are often highly marginalised in the in the world of professional academic life. But in however we unpack the business of theorizing, it seems to me that in our contemporary university world, it's always connected with other forms of knowledge making labour. It never exists in a vacuum. Now, I want to come finally back to the point that a form of work implies a workforce. And in the contemporary academic world, pardon me, this workforce is global, both in the sense of the contemporary producers of various forms of theory can be found around the world, and in the sense that the flows of information, which represent, if you like, the raw material of theorizing, the archive, the encounters with the world, those flows of information, of data, to use the common language about it, are indeed global. They're not, although especially in post-colonial debates, people often speak of disciplinary knowledge as Western science. In fact, it's imperial science, sourced globally, and still is. It's not just the matters, the kind of flows of knowledge that we see with, say, Linnaeus and Darwin. It's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is drawing masses and masses of data from the post-colonial world, even though the number crunching and theoretical model building mostly occurs in the United States or Western Europe. So global, huge, very large numbers of bodies involved in this labour. But we also have to reckon with the enormous inequalities among this workforce, which are both material inequalities of resources in the universities of different parts of the world, for instance, but also cultural in the sense of the hegemony of elite knowledge institutions in the global north, the Stanfords, the Harvards, at least before Donald Trump got going on Harvard, Oxbridge and so forth, have enormous prestige, and the work that they do has very much wider influence in the world than the work that might be done in most post-colonial countries. And one of the key reasons for that is the division of labour that was established at an earlier stage in the history of the global economy of knowledge, where a division arose between the colonised world as a source of raw information and the work of theory, which was largely located in elite institutions of the global north, the Botanic Gardens, the museums, the universities, the research institutes, and so forth. And that division of labour still largely exists. Now, think about the history of the knowledge formation. Immediately reminds us that there are other forms of knowledge which have been excluded or incorporated only in a marginal and often distorted way in the mainstream disciplinary organisation of knowledge. There I would include points made, for instance, by women's liberation theorists back in the 70s and 80s, who argued that bodies of knowledge about bodies, particularly about women's bodies held by women practitioners of healing and prognostication, were deliberately excluded from the development of disciplinary knowledge. Indigenous knowledge too, which in some fields, such as the ones mapped by Edward Said in his book Orientalism, became an object of disciplinary knowledge, but as a form of knowledge in its own right was very much devalued and marginalised by the development of disciplinary knowledges. And yet, those were real and practical organisations of knowledge, as we see in anthropological work about communities in Australia, for instance, and in other parts of the world. And that in turn leads us to think perhaps about what happens to these marginalised bodies and forms of knowledge in the post-colonial world after the apparent autonomy, political autonomy of the decolonisation eras. And this is pretty much what I call Southern theory, which was an attempt to recognise the conceptual importance of knowledge that was produced by the colonised or by formerly colonised peoples. Listening to what Nikita told us about the question of tension strikes me as an excellent example of this form of knowledge existing at the margin, sometimes in opposition to disciplinary biomedical knowledge, but nevertheless real and effective and grounded in experience. I can immediately add another couple of examples of knowledge about bodies of this kind. A little while ago, I was involved in a project which looked at the making of new areas of knowledge in what I call the southern tier of Australia, South Africa, Brazil, Argentina, and so forth. Became very interested in some observations that were made by people that the project interviewed in South Africa around AIDS, HIV AIDS, where the point was made fairly forcibly that although what biomedical science regards as the cutting edge form of knowledge in the AIDS HIV research area is now large scale quantitative multivariate studies, this still fundamentally depends on local knowledge, the local knowledge of the people who recruited into it and the local knowledge of the people who actually articulate between the formal data analysis and what is happening on the ground. And without that, the apparatus of sophisticated multivariate biomedical research would not function at all. The second point I want to give is about trans existence and the way that trans lives are principally theorized. Most of the writing that you'll find in the English language about these questions, you'll find a dominant form of theorizing which focuses very largely on questions of identity, social norms, and the subversion or disruption of social norms through the assertion of deviant identities. I mean, I'm summarising rather crudely, but I'm sure many people will recognise this way of laying this conceptual language. In Argentina, there has been a very interesting line of thinking fairly recently, which goes in a very different direction to my mind. In the work of people like Lohana Berkins, if you want to follow it up, I can give you the references, which looks at trans, especially the lives of travestis, not in terms of personal identity, but in terms essentially of the politics of the family and the state, and so constructs trans existence largely in terms of a political process of change. We could go into that in more detail, but I've taken up more than my time already. So I'll just wave goodbye to those examples and finish with a couple of takeaway messages I would like to offer from these reflections. One, theory matters, and it matters because of its capacity to connect and connect knowledge and practice. Secondly, which follows from the point I made right at the start, theory doesn't really revolve around the story of great men. Of course, we have our Einsteins and our Foucaults and so forth, and we'd be poorer without them. But most of the theorizing that happens in the world is, in fact, a collective process involving collective projects of knowledge articulation and development. Everyone, in principle, who's concerned with knowledge at all can be involved in that process. Thank you.